Welcome back to another edition of the State of the Industry Report. It may not be the definitive, as we've seen the state of the industry published already, maybe, but we are here with the providers of a giant set of data to give you our best available truth as a group from the DTC Index. And I will allow each of them to introduce themselves as we dive in. To my right, Mr. Steve Recook. Who are you and what is the data you're providing?
I'm director of data at Common Thread Collective, and I'm aggregating data from Statless.io, our platform we use at Common Thread Collective, and that a number of other brands pay into to utilize from us, as well as consumer confidence data that I get actually from eCommerce and our buddy over there, Jeremiah.
Well, that's a good tee up. Jeremiah, who are you and what is the data you're providing?
I'm Jeremiah, founder and CEO of eCommerce. We work with close to 4,000 brands, helping them survey their customers. And there's a subset of about 50 million responses per year that we look at for some of the research that we do here. And it's all aggregated and anonymized, and we're really trying to understand big macro trends in discovery and who people are buying for and all kinds of different pieces of information like that.
And last but most, in terms of data, Yarden, who are you and what are you bringing?
Hey, what's up? I'm the co-founder CEO of Veros. We basically provide KPI real-time benchmarking for digital marketing and Shopify metrics. It's a first-party data co-op from nearly 7,000 brands, about $6 billion of ad spend. Yeah, so we're looking at that large database for these insights here.
Awesome. And today we are going to be diving into the month of May. So it is June 10th today as we record, and we're going to be looking back on the month of May that included some key e-commerce cultural moments, in particular Mother's Day and the beginnings of shopping for Father's Day. We're going to explore that, as well as trying to understand consumer sentiment, macro performance of our industry, and tease a little bit of what you're going to be getting in the May edition, which should be out this week. If you haven't signed up yet, DTCindex.com is where you can sign up to receive this report. And if you sign up now, June 50 will get you $50 off this month's edition, as well as access to all the previous editions. These reports are beautiful, they're rich, and they're, I think, almost 70 pages long, I think is our longest one. So they are stock full of really valuable information, some of which we're going to discuss today. And we want to start, Steve, with a little bit of the consumer confidence and the macro environment that we've looked at. So you teased a little bit about our DTCCI chart that we've been tracking for over a year now that is in partnership with eCommerce, where we're asking a bunch of respondents about their personal sentiment as it relates to the economy. But where are we at and what are you seeing in the month of May as it relates to consumer sentiment for e-commerce consumers?
We've actually seen quite a nice bump kind of the end of April, beginning of May, and into May. We're at like 112.2 out of, with 100 being kind of our median or average, actually, index. And that has kind of really been reflective of kind of a pretty good outlook by e-commerce consumers that we're looking at in terms of their view of the economy. It sounds like we're ahead of the Conference Board numbers that they published. They were kind of looking down the beginning of this year, whereas we kind of been tracking upward since March. They recently finally bumped up in the last month from 97.5 to 102, but we've kind of been running a little bit hotter than that for a little bit longer. We've been above that since about early March. So we're looking pretty good in terms of those numbers at least for e-commerce consumers that we're surveying.
Yeah, and part of the intention with this was to try to draw some specificity to the consumers in our industry specifically. And so two comparative things. Steve just mentioned the U.S. Consumer Confidence Index put out by the Conference Board, which saw the consumer confidence rise in May to 102 from 97. So they had the same directional movement that we did. But another report that I found that we're going to include some reference to in this month's edition was the McKinsey & Company produced a consumer packaged good sentiment report. And the headline there leads with U.S. consumer sentiment. Are consumers on the cusp of a shift? And they published consumer optimism declining after peaking last quarter. Now, to be fair, their decline was a decline from mixed from optimistic to a slight change, an increase in mixed, and a slight change, an increase in in pessimistic. So very subtle changes. And what I want to maybe come back to you, Steve, with is that in all three of these different reference points is what I see when I look at the charts, and we're going to include these in this month's edition for you to see visually, is actually that much change overall, is that there seems to be a bit of stability in the consumer sentiment over this year so far. Do you think that's a fair conclusion?
Yeah, that is a fair conclusion. We've also seen that kind of intent. So I talked about the one component, the economy, and their overall view of the economy and how that's kind of been pretty high this year. But we've also seen kind of a slight increase in their intent to purchase in the most recent month, as well as that 3-month segment. So relative to that report from McKinsey, we're actually seeing a little bit more positive feedback.
Yeah. And even if I look at the DTCCI reports versus, I know you're always tracking them as it relates to the S&P 500, the DJIA. And in both of those cases, we've seen continued forward progress in the stock market, right? So we've been trying to map consumer sentiment as it relates to the market. And I would say that's actually even been more positive than the consumer sentiment reports.
Right. Yeah. And we have a pretty good correlation there. The economic sentiment versus the S&P 500 and the Dow Jones Industrial Average, we're running around 0.9, just slightly below. It's 0.87 to 0.89, depending on the particular open or close that I'm using, and then normalizing it. So it winds up being pretty closely related to the stock market, which, yes, is actually bumped up a little bit more this past month than our economic sentiment even.
And one of the other questions that we ask is about the spread between plans for spending in the present versus the future. And that tends to reflect moments when customers are declaring an intent to spend their money presently. And as an example, that response tends to peak dramatically in December and in the end of Q4, when obviously it's a gift-giving moment. But we've seen this increased in declaration to spend presently over the last 3 months versus a flattening or decline in future spending. So we seem to see a little bit more general positive sentiment across the reported behavior, as well as a declaration for spending.
That's right. Yeah, we've seen kind of a little bit of an uptick from the lows of the doldrums of winter in the present spending. And then you're right, like a little bit more flat in terms of future spending. That's up from the beginning of the year. Obviously, January, everyone says they're going to cut, or in December, everyone's cutting back on their future spending. Their intent was, I've purchased my Christmas gifts, my holiday gifts, and then the future spending for the next 3 months is probably less than what they've done during December.
Yeah.
Oh.
And it was interesting to see in the McKinsey report, they asked a similar question around plans to splurge. So their question was related with regards to product and services. Will spending money on, do you plan to splurge or treat yourself over the next 3 months? And they broke it down actually by generation. So they looked at Gen Z, millennials, Gen X, baby boomers, and all generations. And they actually found that Gen Z had the highest intent to splurge in the near future, whereas millennials and Gen X tend to be more likely to pull back, especially in the higher income brackets. Overall, across all age generations, the low income and middle income actually said they were likely to splurge, where the high income tended to be pulling back. And so, Jeremiah, this is the thing we thought, hey, could we use the information we have from No Commerce to slice our survey in a similar way and compare it to what McKinsey found? So can you talk a little bit about how we'll look at that for the upcoming edition?
Yeah, so we're asking a few questions. Looking at backward spending, so have you spent more or less recently? Are you expecting to spend more or less in the future? And also, what's your perception of the future of the economy? And so those 3 questions I think would all be really interesting broken down like this. What is interesting is that we see in the past when we've looked at this data, we actually have not, we've seen older demographics having a little bit more confidence in the future of the economy. So it's a little bit different question. So we'll break that down and see, has anything shifted there? Is that changing over time? But also there's a really interesting point as we were kind of talking through this prior to actually recording this. I think it's worth stating that splurge may mean different things for different generations. So I think that was, Steve, your point, but splurging, if you're a Gen Z, probably means less actual spending than potentially the standard spending for somebody who's 65 plus. So that's something that we'll look at a little bit too, is how does AOV play in with these people? Is there actually a difference in how much these people are spending? And what it looks like moving forward into the future.
You know what else is sorry, you know what was surprising about this? Like when I was reading the McKinsey report and bringing it back to our world in D2C, is that like first of all, sentiment is high, high relative to where we are. It continues to be, but in this slight decline that I had in the past couple of months, a lot of things that were cited is inflation is so high, so I can't really afford to spend more. And I try to look at in Veros's data, like AOV differences. I said maybe the revenue increases are because of inflation. Maybe there's bigger inflation in D2C, and these are driven by a inflation increases. And AOV is actually not super up in Veros. It's up to 1-2% year over year in May, and that surprised me because I mean, maybe I don't know. Maybe any of you guys have a theory on why that is, but I would have expected that it would go up, similar to how we've seen the rest of the economy be very hot in terms of inflation.
Well, I wonder if there's a relationship, because one of the things we've seen is continued growth in discount rates a little bit, where maybe some of that price increase is being masked a little bit by increased discounting. So maybe there's some offset there that could be worth exploring. But you're sort of teasing the lead here, Yarden, which is that you're trying to search for reasons why revenue is up substantially. So maybe you can give us a view of all this sentiment. Okay, that's great. Survey data, people's feelings, but give us the facts. How is e-commerce doing in the month of May, and how did it perform year over year? Are we still seeing growth?
Well, yeah. In reality, I mean, it's not the most. Or it's exciting in my mind to report that things continue to be good. 7-figure brands up 42% year over year in May, 25% up for 8 and 9-figure brands year over year in May. This is on a revenue basis. Again, this is based off thousands of companies, ultimately statistically significant. I mean, this is actually what is happening. Brands are, for the most part, having a good year, on 8 and 9-figure brands, 25% year over year. That's putting up a good number. On 7-figure brands, we even see closer to a normalization of revenue coming from new and repeat customers. And on 8 and 9-figure brands, that spread is larger, 42% year over year growth on the revenue side from repeat revenue and only 13 coming from new revenue. So, yeah, and then increased spend across the ad platforms as well, up 23% year over year on Meta, up 8% year over year on Google. And interestingly, on Meta, this PPM had a big increase, nearly 20% increase in May, but click-through rate and conversion rate were up a bunch as well. So ROAS was actually flat even with the spend increase, which is quite impressive.
23% increase in spend, flat ROAS, 17%. But TikTok, though, spend down pretty substantially in that channel.
Yeah, TikTok spend has been down consistently for the past few months, and ROAS is, up a bit, but not as much as you'd expect for the spend to be down. But, as we spoke about, TikTok is transforming itself in terms of an ad platform. Introducing TikTok shops, introducing a lot more different engaging content. It's not just ads. So, while it's a big channel, they are diversifying there. So, some of that spend shifts from the ad platforms, but it doesn't go away from, spending time and energy on the platform.
So to recap May, 7-figure brands up 42% year over year. 8 and 9-figure brands up 25% year over year. And this is for 7-figure brands now 4 consecutive months of annual growth in excess of 20%. For 8 and 9-figure brands, we've seen it go from about a 5% growth in February to about an 18% in March to almost 29% in April and then 25% in May. So we're seeing a steady, consistent output of growth that sort of, in my head, what I consistently see is a map to this semi-stability. These aren't 100% year-over-year growth numbers, just like consumer sentiment isn't bouncing multiple standard deviations every direction every month, but we're seeing growth. repeated, consistent growth. And we're seeing it while spend goes up on Meta. These are sort of the general common themes of our industry. And we can say that May reported another month that reflected.
Yeah. And I think, speaking from experience in how people use Veros a lot, which is more on the ad platforms, very tactically, was it me or was it the market? If my cost went up, then, was it just me? And that means I need to change things, or was it everyone? And that means I need to stay stable. But for some reason, on the revenue side, people have this view of sentiment being very negative. And even if they're having a softer 2024, they're sort of putting it on the market. They're sort of blaming it on the market, not really changing things because based off what's on social media. And I would stress to actually look at these numbers and also go into Veros and look at in your category. Maybe it's a little different for your category in terms of change. Different categories are affected in different ways. But if in your category revenue is up for others and it's not for you, that's okay. But it does mean that you probably need some change, or you probably need some different tactics, and you shouldn't just assume that this is what's happening to everyone. So I think it's very important to take this data in and act on it.
Yeah, I think it's great. In every scenario, the data in a benchmark or a context is an opportunity for you to think about how to differentiate yourself from the mean always, right? And whether that mean is positive or negative, I think you have a baseline then to operate from, but the goal should be to constantly seek out novel actions to differentiate yourself in performance. And it's a constant reminder that in this moment in particular, like the market is not the reason for the suppression of growth. General consumer sentiment and spending is fine. It's not a crazy hyperbolic period, but it's solid. Consumers plan to spend, businesses are growing. And so that's the environment in which we exist. And if we think about May, a big piece of that has to do with Mother's Day. It's one of the 5 cultural tenets of e-commerce purchasing behavior. If I can lump our friends over at Amazon Prime Day as our 5th made up one that we threw in there alongside Valentine's Day, Mother's Day, Father's Day, and Black Friday. But how did that go? Did we see a similar sort of solid expectation of growth year over year for Mother's Day, Yarden?
Yeah, I can start, and Jeremiah has got a lot to add here, I think, as well. And so, from the revenue side, I mean, we looked at 14 days before up until Mother's Day, and this all in the newsletter. And we looked at day over day revenue change, or just daily revenue between 2024 and 2023. And we saw about a 35%, consistently about a 35% year-over-year increase in the days leading up to Mother's Day for 2024 than was 2023. We saw, interestingly, big spike in both years, 9 days before the holiday, up until about 7 days or 6 days before. And then the biggest difference of this year, other than the gap into the increase in 2024, was the 2 days leading up to Mother's Day were really strong, including Mother's Day, were really strong this year, even stronger than they were last year. So Mother's Day in general was a good holiday this year, and brands saw significant increases than what they saw last year.
Yeah, hopefully we can take some credit for that, trying to get people to buy on Mother's Day. Right,
That's what I was gonna say. I mean, we've been talking about it, so hopefully that's because people took note and kept running their ads through Mother's Day, because people do still buy through Mother's Day. We've seen that in the data. Yeah, on our side, I mean, we're seeing some interesting stuff actually. So year over year, we actually have seen a softer gifting rate in terms of the percentage of people buying gifts. So more shopping in general is good. It's up, but it does look like people are purchasing gifts less often. But the gifts are higher AOV. So there's a few different potential reasons for that. We're going to be diving in more in the newsletter to why that could be. Differences in the number of customers who are new versus returning. We also are just seeing a little bit of a difference in total gifting rate this year in terms of year over year from last year. And then there's also just the fact, like the one thing with our data set is we are not looking necessarily at who was collecting data a year ago and are they collecting data this year? So there's 400,000 responses basically to that question. So it's a pretty good, sorry, in the month of May, 400,000 responses to that question. So good number of respondents coming in. I don't think that should impact the data too much, but we'll kind of break down a few of those different things in the newsletter. But yeah, in general, year over year, gifting as a percentage of purchases was a little bit softer for Mother's Day, but the AOV was way up. And I do think that's probably a good sign overall. The number one way to grow your revenue is actually to get each customer to spend more money. So it's good news that we're seeing that happening this year.
So given that we now know that we are sitting here for the third month in a row, sort of telling you things are up and they're pretty good and they're solid and people are spending on Meta, we want to start to layer in some more specific analysis about the kinds of things that are true for the top performers so that you can say, okay, great. Thanks for letting me know why things are winning, but what is true about those brands that are winning? So in this month's edition, we're going to tease right now 3 in-depth research projects that we did to help answer some specific questions. And the first one comes straight out of something that I've been mired in lately on Twitter, which is about creative output and volume. And so one of the things that we wanted to analyze was for the top performing brands on Meta, how many ads are they making and launching each month relative to their spend tier? So Yarden, maybe you can talk a little bit about the research that you're doing here and how we're going to publish that in the upcoming survey or in the upcoming report.
Yeah. So if you think about the scale at Veros, we can really see from bird's eye view what is actually working and what strategy people are taking. So, of course, creative is the biggest lever that people have in terms of the ad platforms work well there. So we are breaking down based off spend and other KPIs in different buckets, what the high performers are outputting in terms of a number of creative per month, whether that's new creatives or they have creatives live that have impression. And, this should be a guide for people to know to target how many creatives they should launch, whether they're in that current spend bucket or they're trying to get there and know what they need to get there.
Great. So that will be a deep dive section of this month's report. And the next thing we're going to look at is an interesting set of data coming out of eCommerce that has to do with AOV by different channel source. So Jeremiah, tell us a little bit about what you're going to be breaking down on that.
Yeah, so looking at 2023 data, specifically at a set of about 13 million responses to the question, how did you first hear about us? We are analyzing the click source of that and comparing it to the survey response source, right? So for example, somebody could say, I found you on Facebook, but the click says that they came through Google. And so we're going to be looking at that data, breaking down some of this, but really the question that we're trying to answer is getting somebody to see an ad on Facebook, click the ad and buy the most profitable path to conversion? I think and Taylor, I know, one day click analyzing all this stuff. I'm not trying to say you should not be doing one day click analysis and using that as kind of your source of truth. But what I am saying is that there may be something interesting here where higher AOVs come out of people doing more research and kind of having a longer path to conversion. So we're going to be breaking down some of that, looking at basically all the major ad platforms and that AOV when they're coming directly from the platform versus when they're coming through something like search.
Yeah, and I think there's an interesting overlay here between one of the most common media buying errors I see brands make, which is that when the vast majority of your spending is on lowest cost optimization, you tend to drive towards products with lower purchase value. And so it's very common for me to see someone's Facebook account reported AOV be much lower than their site-wide AOV. And so there's an interesting corollary here. And it's also why we were told this past week by our Meta reps that there's an internal initiative inside of Meta to go from 6% of spend, which is currently on value optimized campaigns, to 25% of spend on value optimized campaigns by 2025. I think these things all have a relationship to one another in terms of some of the behavior. So it's really going to be interesting to take a look at. And on that note, speaking of fact checking Meta, and by that I mean trying to understand how the broad data that they present relates back to our industry, because that's our job here, the direct-to-consumer index, is to ask a question about ASC. So ASC, I just came back from the Meta Performance Summit, is the golden goose. It's the prize child of the Meta advertising platform. And they are encouraging advertisers to increase spend in the most recent set of presentations that they did from 30% of spend to 70% of spend. This is you're going to hear research about increasing spend in those things. And so we wanted to look at how is ASC performing compared to BAU for e-commerce brands specifically, because Meta will tout that ASC has improved efficiency across all the advertisers, but we wanted to slice it down and look at our industry and see, okay, how is ASC performing both on new customers and returning, as well as overall efficiency for ASC versus BAU. So Yarden, can you tell us a little bit about what they're going to see as it relates to that question?
Yeah, I think you highlighted it well. It's basically, we're gonna split out campaigns versus BAU campaign, and we're gonna track the ROAS there and the cost per purchase that brands are seeing, and see how much and if there is true uplift there. And on the road, if time allows, may just check that for PMAX as well.
Good old PMAX. So there you have it. May has been a solid month. It's a good indication that our industry continues to be healthy. Consumer confidence remains stable and slightly optimistic amidst everything that's going on. And if this month's issue at DTCindex.com, you can get an in-depth deep dive into 3 compelling projects that you can go and apply to your business directly. One is about the amount of creative output that the highest performers on the platform are producing. Number 2 is about how channel source from first click affects AOV. And then the third is to analyze the performance of ASC versus BAU. All available in this month's edition, DTCindex.com. And remember, use June 50 to get $50 off this month's issue, as well as access to our entire library of reports from this year. Appreciate you all tuning in, gentlemen. Thank you all for stopping by.
Thanks.
Speak soon.